The night was bitterly cold, and a thick layer of fog blanketed the fields, cloaking the world in an eerie stillness. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, amplifying the unsettling quiet of the deserted road. On the shoulder of the narrow highway, a still figure emerged from the darkness, a shape that seemed lifeless at first glance. As the pale moonlight broke through the fog, the shape came into focus. It was a horse, gaunt and frail, standing precariously as though the weight of its body was too much to bear. Its ribs jutted out sharply against its skin, every hollow and curve a testament to weeks, maybe months, of starvation. Blood stained its legs, and deep cuts, raw and unhealed, marred its thin frame. Its mane was tangled with mud, leaves, and branches, a grim tangle of neglect. But it was the eyes that told the story. Wide, dark, and brimming with a mixture of fear and profound sorrow, they seemed almost human. They carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 unanswered cries for help. Those eyes spoke of suffering, abandonment, and a long, slow surrender to despair. In the distance, the faint hum of an approaching car broke the oppressive silence. The headlights pierced the fog, illuminating the horse. The sudden burst of light startled the animal, and it flinched weakly, but it didn't move away. It was too tired, too broken to even attempt escape. The car came to an abrupt halt, its brakes screeching on the slick pavement. Inside, Emily and Jack, a couple in their late 30s, sat frozen, staring at the haunting figure in front of them. Emily's hand instinctively went to her chest. "Jack, is that a horse? Is it even alive?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack didn't answer immediately. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "It's alive," he muttered finally. "But just barely." Without another word, Emily pushed the door open and stepped out, her breath visible in the frigid air. Her boots crunched against the gravel as she approached cautiously, her heart pounding. Up close, the sight was even worse than she'd imagined. "Oh my God," she gasped. "How could someone let this happen?" Jack joined her, carrying a flashlight from the glove box. He shined it gently on the horse, careful not to startle it further. The beam revealed every jagged scar, every gash, every filthy inch of the animal's body. "This isn't neglect," he said grimly. "This is abuse. Somebody did this on purpose." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she took a hesitant step forward, her hand outstretched. "Hey there, it's okay. We're not going to hurt you," she said softly, her voice shaking with emotion. The horse flinched, its ears twitching at the sound of her voice. Its body tensed as it tried to step back, but stumbled, too weak to go far. "It's terrified," Jack said, lowering the flashlight. "God knows what it's been through." Emily crouched slightly, trying to appear less threatening. "We can't just leave it here, Jack. It won't survive the night," she said, her voice breaking. Jack sighed heavily. He knew she was right, but the task ahead seemed impossible. How could they help a creature so damaged, so close to the edge? "We'll figure it out," he said finally, his tone resolute. The horse's trembling intensified as the couple stood there, caught between urgency and uncertainty. The cold seeped into their bones, but they refused to leave. The forest rustled faintly in the distance, the fog hung heavy around them, and the horse's shallow, ragged breathing filled the air. It wasn't just a question of saving the horse's life, it was about earning its trust, convincing it that not all humans meant harm. And as Emily knelt there, her hand still outstretched, she felt an ache in her chest that mirrored the animal's suffering. In that moment, she made a silent promise. Whatever it took, no matter how long it took, they wouldn't give up on this broken creature. Because beneath the scars, the wounds, and the fear, there was something worth saving. Emily and Jack lived a modest life on a small farm just a few miles from the highway. Their days were simple, tending to their chickens, growing a small vegetable garden, and occasionally taking in stray animals from the nearby woods. They weren't horse experts by any stretch, but the haunting look in the animals' eyes had struck something deep within both of them. As they stood on the side of the road, Emily looked at Jack, her face streaked with tears. "We can't just leave him here, Jack. He's barely holding on." Her voice cracked under the weight of her emotions. Jack hesitated for a moment, running a hand through his hair, but then gave a firm nod. "All right," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed his concern. "Let's get him into the trailer." The horse, weak as it was, flinched when they approached with ropes. Every touch made it tremble violently, and each attempt to guide it onto the trailer was met with a desperate, though feeble, resistance. Emily's heart broke with every panicked movement. "It's okay," she whispered over and over, her voice soft but trembling with urgency. "You're safe now. We're going to help you." After what felt like an eternity, they managed to coax the horse onto the trailer. The effort left them both breathless, and as the doors closed behind the frail creature, Emily pressed her forehead against the cold metal, silently praying that they weren't too late. The drive back to the farm was tense and quiet. Emily sat in the back of the truck bed with the horse, holding a thick blanket around its trembling body. Its breath was shallow, its eyes half closed. "I don't think he's going to make it," she whispered, her words barely audible over the hum of the truck. Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw set. "He will," he said, though the certainty in his voice was forced. "He has to." They didn't go straight to the farm. Instead, they drove to a local veterinarian who opened his doors after hours at their frantic call. The vet's face turned grave as soon as he saw the horse. Multiple fractures, severe malnourishment, dehydration, and these scars, he said, running a hand gently over the animal's neck. "He's been abused for a long time. Whoever did this left him to die." Emily felt tears sting her eyes again as she knelt beside the horse, stroking its damp, muddy coat. "But he's alive," she said with quiet determination. "And if he's alive, that means he's still fighting. And so are we." It took hours of care, fluids, painkillers, bandages, to stabilize the horse enough for transport. By the time they arrived back at the farm, the sun was beginning to rise, casting soft pink and gold hues over the fields. Jack and Emily led the horse to a small, makeshift shelter they'd hastily prepared. He stumbled as he walked, and for a moment, Emily thought he might collapse. But he didn't. Somehow, he found the strength to take one step after another. Over the next few days, Emily barely left the horse's side. She offered water in a shallow bowl, coaxing him to drink sip by sip. She fed him small handfuls of soft food, careful not to overwhelm his fragile stomach. Slowly, he began to respond. His breaths grew steadier, his eyes a little brighter. It was Emily who gave him a name, Hope. Every day, she would sit with him, speaking softly, telling him stories about the farm, about the animals she and Jack had rescued before. "You're safe now," she would say again and again. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." But despite her words, she noticed something strange. Hope's gaze was often fixed on the horizon, his ears flicking toward the faintest sounds in the distance. It was as though he were waiting for someone or something that never came. Even as he began to eat more regularly, as his wounds started to heal, the fear never fully left him. He flinched at sudden movements, tensed at the sound of Jack's boots crunching on gravel, and refused to step inside the barn. "He's not just hurt," Emily said one evening, her voice heavy with sadness. "He's broken." Jack looked up from the fence he was mending, his hands calloused and rough. "No," he said after a moment. "He's not broken. He's just waiting for a reason to trust again." Emily stroked Hope's neck, her fingers brushing over the scars that would never fully fade. "Then we'll give him that reason," she said softly. And from that moment, she made a silent promise to the horse. No matter how long it took, she would prove to him that the world wasn't only filled with cruelty. Hope didn't know it yet, but he was home. Weeks had passed, and although Hope's wounds were healing, Emily could see that something inside him remained broken. His body was mending, but his spirit was trapped, shackled by invisible chains of trauma. Every time Emily tried to lead him near the barn, he froze, his hooves digging into the dirt, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. The sight of a fence or the sound of a closing gate sent him into a frenzy of pacing and whinnying, his head jerking up as if he expected to be caught, tied, or hurt again. Even the faintest hum of an engine passing on the nearby road made him tremble, his eyes wide with fear, his muscles taut as though ready to bolt. One afternoon, as Emily brushed his coat under the warm sunlight, she noticed something she hadn't before: deep, old scars encircling his torso, just under the matted fur. They were thin and precise, as though caused by tightly wound ropes or harnesses. Her hand paused mid-stroke, her heart sinking as a horrible realization washed over her. She called the veterinarian, Dr. Harrison, who arrived quickly and studied the scars with a grim expression. After a long silence, he turned to Emily, his voice heavy. "These marks, they're consistent with what we see in horses forced into illegal racing or heavy labor. He was likely tied down, whipped, pushed to the brink. That kind of treatment, it breaks them." Emily's hand clenched into a fist, tears welling in her eyes as anger and sorrow battled for dominance. "Who could do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How can anyone look into those eyes and still be so cruel?" Dr. Harrison placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's lucky to have found you, Emily. But the scars in his mind, those will take much longer to heal." That night, the first drops of rain began to fall as a storm rolled in, lightning flashing in the distance. Emily and Jack huddled inside the house, watching the rain beat against the windows, the steady drumming drowning out the usual peaceful sounds of the farm. Suddenly, a piercing whinny split through the air, louder than the thunder that followed. Emily bolted upright. "Hope!" she cried, rushing toward the door. Jack was right behind her, grabbing a flashlight as they sprinted out into the storm. The scene in the pasture was chaos. Hope was running in frantic circles, his eyes wild, his body glistening with rain and sweat. He charged the wooden fence repeatedly, ignoring the pain each collision brought. He bucked and kicked at the air, his cries filled with terror, his hooves churning up mud as the storm raged around him. "Hope! Stop!" Emily called, her voice desperate, but her words were drowned by the howling wind and the pounding rain. She tried to get closer, but the sight of her approach sent Hope into an even greater panic. His legs slipped in the mud, and he crashed into the fence again, splinters flying as he stumbled back, his sides heaving. Jack grabbed Emily's arm, his voice low and urgent. "Emily, he's going to hurt himself. You can't get too close right now." "But he's terrified." Emily sobbed, her heart breaking as she watched the horse she had fought so hard to save unravel before her eyes. "What can we do?" Hope gave one last desperate buck, his rear legs slipping, and he collapsed into the mud, panting heavily. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the rain mingling with Emily's tears as she knelt a few feet away, not daring to move closer but unable to look away. Jack finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Emily, if he keeps living like this, if he can't let go of whatever they did to him, he'll never be happy here. We've done everything we can, but maybe this isn't enough for him." Emily's head snapped toward Jack, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Are you saying we should give up on him?" Jack shook his head, his face shadowed by the dim beam of the flashlight. "I'm saying that maybe what he needs, we can't give it to him. He deserves a chance to truly heal, Emily. And if that's not here, we have to think about what's best for him." The words hit Emily like a blow to the chest. She knew Jack was right, Hope was alive, but he wasn't truly living. Still, the thought of letting him go, after all they had been through, felt like abandoning him all over again. She turned back to the horse, still lying in the mud, his sides rising and falling with exhausted breaths. I don't know how to let him go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. In that moment, Emily realized the fight wasn't just about saving Hope's life, it was about helping him find the peace that had been stolen from him. And for the first time, she wondered if loving him meant making the hardest decision of all. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the sunlight filters through the trees in soft, golden streams, and the air smells of dew and fresh earth. Emily walked alongside Hope in an open field, the tall grass brushing against her legs and swaying gently in the breeze. For the first time in weeks, Hope seemed calm. His steps, though measured, were steady, and his ears flicked toward the distant sounds of birdsong instead of shrinking back in fear. Emily allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally turning a corner. She ran her hand along Hope's neck, murmuring softly, "You're doing so well, boy. We'll get there, I promise." But then, something shifted. Hope's ears pricked sharply forward, and his body went rigid. His head shot up, nostrils flaring as he turned toward the horizon. "What is it?" Emily asked, alarmed. She followed his gaze and saw it, a lone figure on horseback, emerging slowly from the distant tree line. The man, an elderly rider with a weathered face and a slouched posture, was guiding his horse at a slow, deliberate pace. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, though she didn't know why. Before she could react, Hope let out a piercing whinny, his body trembling as if charged by an invisible force. He stomped his hooves and whinnied again, this time louder, a desperate sound that echoed through the field. "Hope, calm down," Emily said, her voice shaking as she tightened her grip on his lead. But Hope wasn't listening. He strained against her, pulling toward the approaching figure as though every fiber of his being demanded it. The man slowed to a halt, his wide eyes fixed on the frantic horse. For a moment, he didn't move, as if he were frozen in disbelief. Then, almost hesitantly, he dismounted, his legs unsteady as he stepped closer. Emily held her ground, unsure whether to trust the stranger, but Hope's reaction was unlike anything she had ever seen. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice firm but cautious. "Can I help you?" The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze was locked on Hope, his expression a mix of shock and something deeper, something that looked heartbreakingly like recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, trembling with emotion. "That horse, I know that horse." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The man took another step forward, his weathered hands trembling at his sides. "Years ago, I raised thoroughbreds for racing," he began, his voice cracking with the weight of old memories. "One day, a gang came through. They stole my horses, every single one. I searched for them for years, but I never found them. Most people told me they were either killed or sold off." He paused, his eyes never leaving Hope. Tears welled up and spilled down his sunken cheeks as he continued, "But this one, he was my best. My brightest. I called him Victory. And when they took him, it broke me. I thought he was dead. I thought they'd all died." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at Hope, who was now straining against the lead rope, desperate to get closer to the man. And then, as if confirming everything, the horse let out another anguished whinny, his entire body quivering. The man, his voice shaking, whispered, "Victory, is it really you?" Emily, overwhelmed, released the lead rope, and what happened next took her breath away. Hope, Victory, stepped forward, hesitantly at first, then faster, until he was standing before the man. The old man reached out a trembling hand, and for a moment, it seemed like Hope might pull away. But instead, the horse lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against the man's chest. The man sobbed openly, his hands gently cradling the horse's face. "It's you," he choked out. "It's really you. I'm so sorry, I couldn't protect you. I'm so sorry." Hope, as if understanding every word, stood completely still, his eyes soft and full of something Emily hadn't seen before, peace. The man leaned in, whispering something only Hope could hear. Whatever he said, it seemed to unlock something deep within the horse. Hope let out a long, low sigh and rested his head against the man's shoulder, his trembling finally subsiding. Emily watched, tears streaming down her own face, as the two stood together, the past and present colliding in a moment so raw and profound that it felt almost sacred. For the first time, she saw not a broken horse, but one who had found the piece of himself that had been missing all along. And in that moment, Emily realized that Hope had been waiting all this time, not just for safety, but for home. Daniel stood before Emily and Jack, his weathered face etched with sincerity and longing. "Please," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Let me take care of him. I owe him that much." Emily's heart wavered. She glanced at Jack, searching his face for an answer. Her voice, when it came, was filled with hesitation. "How can I know he'll be safe with you? He's suffered enough, more than enough. I can't bear the thought of him being hurt again." Daniel took a step closer, his hands trembling slightly. "I know what you're thinking. I can see it in your eyes. But I swear to you, those days, my days with the races, they're behind me. Victory wasn't just a horse to me. He was everything. They took him, and it broke me. I didn't just lose a horse that day. I lost my purpose, my family." His voice cracked, and he looked away, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the past. Emily's throat tightened, tears welling in her eyes. She turned to Hope, who stood quietly by Daniel, his head low, but his eyes soft and trusting in a way she hadn't seen before. The horse seemed to have already made his choice. Finally, Emily nodded, though her voice shook as she spoke. "All right, Daniel. But if I find out, if there's even a hint, that he's being mistreated?" Daniel raised his hands, his expression earnest. "You have my word. I'll give him the life he deserves. A life of freedom." Over the following weeks, Emily and Jack visited frequently, watching as Daniel worked tirelessly to rebuild the bond he once had with Hope. Under Daniel's care, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Hope began to thrive, his coat shining with health, his muscles regaining their strength. Daniel never pushed him, never asked more than Hope was ready to give. He let him gallop freely in the open fields, his mane catching the wind, his movements fluid and graceful in a way that seemed to declare his triumph over the pain of the past. Emily stood by the fence one afternoon, watching Hope charge across the field. For the first time, he wasn't running out of fear, he was running for the sheer joy of it. She felt Jack's arm around her shoulders and leaned into him, tears streaming down her face. "He's happy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He's home," Jack replied, his voice steady but filled with warmth. But the most profound moment came weeks later, at an event Daniel organized to celebrate Hope's journey. The small arena was filled with friends, neighbors, and strangers who had come to hear the story of a horse who had endured unimaginable suffering and still found the strength to survive. Daniel stood in the center, holding a microphone, his voice steady but emotional as he recounted Hope's journey. "This horse," he said, gesturing toward Hope, who stood proudly beside him, "is a survivor. He's been through more than any of us could ever imagine. But he's taught me, and all of us, something important. No matter how broken you feel, no matter how hopeless it seems, there's always a way to heal." The audience was silent, many with tears streaming down their faces, as Daniel turned to Hope. The horse, as if sensing the importance of the moment, lifted his head high, his dark eyes scanning the crowd. And then, as if on cue, Daniel unclipped the halter from Hope's head. The horse hesitated for just a moment before breaking into a gallop, his powerful strides sending clouds of dust into the air. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, but to Emily, the world seemed to fall quiet as she watched him run. In that moment, Hope wasn't a racehorse, a victim, or a broken creature. He was free, a symbol of survival, resilience, and the healing power of love. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek as she turned to Jack. "We did the right thing," she said softly. Jack smiled, his hand resting on hers. "No," he replied. "He did the right thing. He chose to fight. We just helped him remember how." As the sun dipped low on the horizon, bathing the field in golden light, Emily watched Hope gallop across the arena, his mane flowing like a banner of triumph. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel before. Peace. Emily stood at the edge of the field, the cool evening breeze tugging gently at her hair. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, as though the world itself had paused to honor the moment. Her eyes were fixed on Hope, who moved freely through the open pasture, his gait smooth, his head held high. There was a quiet power in his stride, a strength that came not from brute force, but from a will to endure. Tears blurred her vision as she watched him. She didn't wipe them away. For weeks, she had cried for his pain, his suffering, and the scars that marked him inside and out. But now, for the first time, her tears were for something else entirely: joy, pride, and a bittersweet sense of gratitude. He found the home he always deserved, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rustling grass. Beside her, Jack placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. They both knew the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Hope wasn't just a horse they had rescued, he was a living testament to resilience, a beacon of what it meant to fight for life even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Hope had endured cruelty beyond imagining. He had been cast aside, forgotten, left to die. Yet here he was, galloping beneath a golden sky, each step a declaration of his triumph over the darkness that had once consumed him. Emily's thoughts drifted as she stood there, the memory of that stormy night flashing through her mind. She had doubted herself so many times, wondered if she had done enough, if she had been enough. But now she understood something she hadn't before. It was never about fixing him or erasing his past. It was about giving him the chance to find himself again, to reclaim the pieces of his spirit that others had tried to destroy. Hope's journey had taught her more than she could ever put into words. He had shown her that healing wasn't linear, that scars, visible or not, were not marks of weakness, but of survival. He had reminded her that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness, the quietest gestures of love, could change the trajectory of a life. But most of all, Hope had given her a gift she hadn't expected. She thought she had saved him, but the truth was, he had saved her. He had reignited a part of her that had long been dormant, the belief that even in the face of despair, there is always room for hope. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field, Emily took a deep breath. Her heart, once heavy with worry and doubt, now felt light. Watching Hope was like watching a phoenix rise from the ashes. Sometimes, she murmured, her voice steady now, a simple act of kindness can transform a life. And sometimes, it transforms more than one. Hope stopped briefly, lifting his head toward the sky as if sensing her words. The fading light caught in his eyes, turning them to molten gold. For a moment, he stood there, proud and unbroken, before breaking into another run. And as Emily watched him disappear into the distance, she smiled through her tears, knowing that his story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever doubted their strength, everyone who had ever felt lost, and everyone who needed to be reminded that even the most broken souls could find freedom. And that, she thought, as the last rays of sunlight kissed the earth, changed everything forever.